laughter cut like a blade, cold and deliberate. Vanessa Holt mocked Naomi Carter in front of 300 donors, laughing at a dress that belonged to a dead mother. Naomi stood steady, clutching a beaded purse that hid her son Marcus's hospital bills and a recording that could topple reputations. 4 minutes later, Charles Whitmore rose and said, "That is my son's mother." Silence swallowed the room. What happened next exposed theft, betrayal, and a board forced to pick conscience or convenience. Would you have stood with Naomi or walked away? Comment below and hit subscribe to see the recording that changes everything, and stay for the boardroom fallout. Inside the ballroom, laughter wasn't joy. It was cruelty dressed in couture. The kind that marks territories and draws bloodlines between those who belong and those who don't. In a ballroom worth more per square foot than most American homes, under chandeliers dripping with a combined $500,000 in crystal, 300 of the wealthiest people in Manhattan were laughing at a woman in ivory. Vanessa Holt stood in scarlet Valentino, her voice carrying like a blade wrapped in silk. Did someone confuse the gala invitation with a charity raffle ticket? The orchestra stopped mid-phrase. Waiters froze with champagne trays suspended. Every eye in that room turned to watch a single mother in a dress that had belonged to her dead mother, standing alone near the marble staircase, clutching a small beaded purse like a shield. Her name was Naomi Carter, and in exactly 4 minutes, the man who had abandoned her would stand up and change everything. By the end of this story, we'll understand together why the woman everyone mocked that night became the symbol of something Wall Street forgot existed. Integrity with a pulse. We're going to watch how one billionaire's blindness, both literal and moral, nearly destroyed the company he built. And we'll witness the moment a boardroom full of sharks chose conscience over convenience. But that moment, it didn't start with justice. It started with cruelty dressed as entertainment. Comment right now if you've ever been underestimated because of how you looked. Picture this. A CEO worth $2.4 billion losing his eyesight in real time, forced to choose between the woman who manipulated his weakness and the woman who once loved him when he had nothing. Imagine a corporate boardroom where a junior accountant finds 18 million rerouted through shell accounts, all leading back to the woman in scarlet who thought charm could replace competence. Envision the hospital room where a 7-year-old boy named Marcus asked his mother why his father never came to visit, while medical bills stacked up like accusations. See the audio recording that played in a silent boardroom, Vanessa's voice cold and calculated as she forged signatures and redirected foundation funds meant for children who looked like Marcus. The courtroom of public opinion. The private apology that came 6 years too late. The foundation that bore Naomi's mother's name. The woman who walked away from billions because some things matter more than money. And finally, the standing ovation that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with truth. To understand how we arrived at that moment, I need to take you back to the night everything unraveled. Back to the gala where laughter stopped mattering and characters started screaming. Charles Whitmore sat at table 1, the power table, the table reserved for men whose names opened doors and closed deals. At 53, he still carried the hunger of the boy who once slept in a '92 Civic with his mother outside a New Jersey truck stop. That hunger had built an empire. That same hunger had also hollowed him out in places money couldn't fill. Tonight, his vision blurred at the edges. The chandelier lights created halos that shouldn't exist. His ophthalmologist had been clear. Retinal degeneration, progressive and irreversible. Within 2 years he would see only shapes and shadows. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent 30 years refusing to see what mattered. And now biology was making that refusal permanent. Beside him, Vanessa laughed that manufactured laugh she deployed at charity auctions and investor dinners. She touched his arm with practiced intimacy, the kind choreographed for cameras and gossip columns. She had entered his life 18 months ago as a consultant, all Harvard credentials and strategic smiles. She had made herself necessary, then desirable, then irreplaceable, or so she believed. What Charles felt when he looked at her was not love. It was the comfort of distraction, the ease of being with someone who wanted him for what he represented rather than who he was. With Vanessa, there were no demands for authenticity, no quiet disappointments, no reminders of the man he had promised to become and failed to be. But across the ballroom, standing near the staircase in a dress that whispered rather than announced, was the woman who had loved him when authenticity was all he had to offer. He saw her. Even through the blur, he recognized the way she held herself, dignity like a spine made of grace. And his heart, that muscle he had trained to stay silent, betrayed him with a single, painful beat. Some people say Charles was just protecting his image. Others call it pure cowardice. What do you think? We'll let you decide. Vanessa spotted Naomi 3 seconds after Charles did. Some predators have radar for vulnerability. Charles, darling. Vanessa's voice rose just enough to carry to the neighboring tables. I didn't realize the event coordinators were doing outreach to community workers tonight. How progressive. Polite chuckles rippled outward like a stone thrown into still water. Naomi stood her ground. She had not come for approval. She had come because Marcus's hospital bills had climbed past $47,000, and the invitation, mysterious as it was, had mentioned a charitable foundation initiative. A desperate mother will walk through fire wearing gasoline. She will certainly walk through a ballroom wearing her mother's dress. Vanessa moved closer, her heels clicking against marble like a countdown. That dress, Vanessa said, tilting her head with performative concern. Is it vintage? Or just old? Laughter, louder now. The kind of laughter that people use to align themselves with power, to make sure they're on the winning side of the joke. Have you ever stood in a room where everyone laughed at your expense? Where your worthiness was measured by thread count and label recognition? Naomi felt that weight, but she did not bend under it. She looked directly at Vanessa and said quietly, "It belonged to my mother. She wore it to her nursing school graduation. She taught me that dignity doesn't come with a price tag." The room inhaled. Somewhere, a glass clinked. Vanessa smiled wider, the kind of smile that precedes violence. How quaint. And tell me what brings nurse, is it, to an event where tickets cost more than most people's monthly rent? Drop a comment if you've ever been judged by people who knew nothing about your story. Naomi opened her mouth to respond, but a voice cut through the tension like a gavel striking wood. That is my son's mother. Charles Whitmore stood. The entire ballroom pivoted, as if pulled by invisible strings. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of a man who had spent decades commanding rooms. "The woman you are mocking," Charles continued, his hand steady on the table edge, "raised our son while I hid behind excuses and cowardice. She worked double shifts so he could eat. She sang him to sleep when I was too proud to even send a card. Her dress might be old, Vanessa, but it has more honor in its seams than anything you've ever worn." Silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of collective shock. 300 people holding their breath, waiting to see what happens when a billionaire chooses truth over image. Naomi's face remained calm, but her hands trembled slightly against her purse. She had not expected this. She had not expected him to remember what honor felt like. Vanessa's smile faltered, then reformed, sharper now, dangerous. "Charles, you're emotional. Perhaps we should step outside and— No. His voice was firm. I'm done stepping outside. I'm done hiding. He turned to Naomi, and even through the blur of failing sight he saw her clearly for the first time in 6 years. I'm sorry, he said, for all of it. But here's what no one in that room knew yet. This wasn't the moment that ruined Vanessa. That came when the board discovered what she'd been doing while Charles couldn't see. And when that truth came out, it didn't just destroy her reputation. It exposed a theft so calculated, so cold, that even Wall Street veterans called it ruthless. Would you forgive a man who abandoned you for 6 years, even if he finally told the truth? What happened in the next 72 hours would prove that sometimes the person you underestimate is the one holding all the cards. And Naomi Carter, she had been holding evidence that would bring an empire to its knees. If you're not subscribed, I need to ask you something. Why not? Because we're about to show you what real justice looks like when a mother fights back. And trust me, you don't want to miss what happens when the board hears the recordings. Before Charles Whitmore owned boardrooms, he owned nothing but shame. Winter, 1987. 9 years old. Face pressed against the fogged window of a '92 Honda Civic. Outside, families walked into a New Jersey diner, their breath making clouds in the cold. Inside the car, his mother counted nickels under the dome light, her fingers red and cracked from the cold. Charles traced patterns in the frost on his window. A family of 4 slid into a booth by the glass. The father loosened his tie. The mother ordered without looking at the prices. 2 kids, maybe his age, poured syrup over pancakes the size of dinner plates. His stomach growled loud enough that his mother heard it. "We'll eat tomorrow, baby." Her voice cracked on the word tomorrow. "I get paid tomorrow." Charles nodded. He had learned not to cry about being hungry. Crying made his mother's hands shake. The car smelled like old French fries from the McDonald's dumpster behind the Texaco station. His father had left 3 months ago with a woman from his construction crew. Left them with half a tank of gas and a note that said, "I can't do this anymore." Through the diner window, the father reached across the table and wiped syrup off his daughter's chin. She laughed. Charles looked away. He made a decision that night, the way children make decisions that shape their entire lives without knowing it. He would never sit in this car again. Never count nickels. Never watch other people eat while his stomach twisted into knots. He would become the man inside the diner, the man with the tie and the clean hands and the children who didn't know what hunger tasted like. Have you ever been the kid on the outside looking in? Comment if you know what that feels like. Because that night created the man who would one day have everything and feel nothing. 23 years later. Charles Whitmore, age 32, stood in a penthouse worth $14 million. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed Manhattan like a trophy. His reflection stared back at him, sharp suit, expensive watch, eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in days. His phone buzzed. Another deal closed. Another 7 figures in his account. He felt nothing. Whitmore Industries had grown from a single software patent into a conglomerate employing over 4,000 people. Forbes called him a visionary. Competitors called him relentless. His assistant called him at 11 p.m. to confirm morning meetings because he never stopped working. On his 47th birthday, his executive team threw him a party in a restaurant that required reservations 6 months in advance. Champagne that cost more per bottle than his mother's monthly salary at the nursing home where she now lived. Dementia stealing her memories one day at a time. 20 people sang happy birthday. He knew 3 of their names. He cut the cake. Smiled for photos. Left after 30 minutes. Back in the penthouse, he stood at the window and tried to remember the last time he'd had a conversation that wasn't about quarterly earnings or market projections. He couldn't. The boy who once watched families through diner windows had become a man who owned restaurants but ate alone. Some say ambition is the price of greatness. Others say it's just fear with better packaging. What do you think? 3 years later, 2 women would enter his life. One would see the empire. The other would see the boy in the Civic. And Charles wouldn't know the difference until it was almost too late. Naomi Carter's hands smelled like hospital-grade soap and desperation at 3 a.m. St. Catherine's Medical Center overnight shift. A gunshot victim bled out in Trauma Bay 3 while his mother screamed in the hallway. Naomi held compression on the wound, her arms shaking from the pressure, watching the monitors like they held answers to prayers. The patient lived. His mother collapsed in relief. Naomi clocked out at 7 a.m., took the Q train home to Queens and arrived at her 1-bedroom apartment as the sun came up. Marcus was still asleep, his small body curled around a stuffed elephant named Peanut. She had 15 minutes before she needed to wake him for school. She used 10 of them to cry in the shower where he couldn't hear. 11 years as a nurse. 11 years of watching people cling to life while she clung to rent payments and grocery budgets. Her mother had been a nurse too, before breast cancer took her 3 years ago. Her father had disappeared into a bottle when Naomi was 12. She learned early, you can't fix broken people, but you can refuse to become them. Every morning, the same routine. Wake Marcus at 7:15. Scrambled eggs, toast, orange juice. Check homework. Pack lunch. Braid love into rituals so steady he'd never doubt he mattered. "Mama," Marcus said one morning, spreading grape jelly with surgical precision. "Why doesn't my dad come see me?" Naomi's hand froze on the coffee pot. She could taste the truth on her tongue, bitter and honest. Because he's ashamed of us. Because we don't fit the image he needs. Because he sends checks instead of presents. Some people don't know how to love out loud, baby. But that's their problem, not yours. Marcus nodded, but his eyes carried hurt too heavy for 7. Naomi added it to the list. Things to forgive. Things to never forget. If you're raising a child alone, drop a comment right now. Because what Naomi did for Marcus is what heroes actually look like. Brooklyn Community Center, 2012. Health fair in the gymnasium. Charles sat in a folding chair, tie loosened, watching his investor pitch fall apart in real time. 3 rejections in 1 week. His startup was bleeding money. His apartment had roaches. His suit was tailored, but the shoes had a hole in the left sole he covered by walking carefully. "Blood pressure check?" A voice, warm like Sunday morning. He looked up, a woman in scrubs, maybe 23, holding a blood pressure cuff and a smile that didn't look rehearsed. "Can you check if I'm still alive?" Charles asked. "I'm not completely sure. Arm out." She wrapped the cuff around his bicep. Her hands were steady, clinical, kind, pumped it tight. Watch the gauge. 120/80. You're alive. Stressed, but alive. Story of my life. What's stressing you? She unwrapped the cuff but didn't move away. Charles opened his mouth to deliver the polished pitch, the investor-friendly version. The story that made failure sound like strategy. Instead, the truth fell out. "I'm building something I think matters, but I can't tell if I'm doing it because I believe in it or because I'm terrified of being poor again." Naomi sat down in the chair beside him. Maybe both, and maybe that's human. Something loosened in his chest, a knot he'd been tying tighter for 20 years. Her name was Naomi. She was in nursing school. She worked 3 jobs and still volunteered on weekends. She talked about her mother's hands. how they stayed steady even during earthquakes. For 6 months they were inevitable. Takeout on her apartment floor. Prospect Park at midnight. She told him about growing up with an alcoholic father and a praying mother, how she learned to choose which one to become. He told her about the Civic, the diner, counting nickels while other families ate. "You're not that boy anymore," Naomi whispered one night, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. Charles didn't answer, because he was still that boy. He would always be that boy. And the thing about fear is it doesn't leave just because you have money now. The pregnancy was unplanned. Naomi told him on a Tuesday in his apartment, her hands steady but her voice shaking at the edges. "I'm 7 weeks along. I'm keeping the baby. I need to know if you're staying." Charles felt the floor tilt. His company was 3 months from the biggest investment deal he'd ever negotiated. $52 million. Old money investors from Connecticut who wore ties to breakfast and cared about bloodlines and optics. His phone buzzed. The lead investor. He stared at the screen. "Take it," Naomi said quietly. "No, Take the call, Charles." He took the call, stepped into the bedroom, talked for 7 minutes about market projections while Naomi sat on his couch, one hand on her still flat stomach. When he came back, she was standing. "Naomi, this is complicated. It's yes or no." Silence stretched between them like a chasm. "I'm about to close the biggest deal of my career," Charles said, the words feeling like glass in his throat. "My investors are traditional. Conservative. They care about image. A child out of wedlock with—" He stopped. "With someone who isn't rich," Naomi finished. "Someone who doesn't fit. That's not what You're ashamed of me. I'm protecting what I've built. By pretending I don't exist." Charles ran both hands through his hair. "I'll support you. Financially. Whatever you need. But publicly I can't be tied to this right now. Just until the deal closes, then we can—" Naomi picked up her purse. "I don't need your money, Charles. I needed you. Past tense." She walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the knob. "You know what's sad? You're still that boy in the Civic. Still watching through windows. Still thinking you're on the outside. The difference is now you're rich and you're still alone." The door closed. Charles told himself it was temporary. Strategic. He'd circle back after the deal. But cowardice, once chosen, becomes a reflex. Would you have walked away, or stayed and fought for someone too scared to fight for themselves? Tell me in the comments. 6 years later. St. Catherine's Medical Center, Pediatric ICU. Naomi sat beside Marcus's bed, watching monitors translate her son's heartbeat into green lines and beeps. The playground accident had been fast. A fall from the monkey bars, a wrong angle, internal bleeding they missed until he collapsed during recess. Surgery scheduled for Monday. Cost $47,000. Insurance covered $23,000. Marcus stirred, eyes fluttering under medication. "Mama? I'm here, baby. Is Dad coming?" Naomi's throat closed. On the table beside the bed sat an envelope. Arrived 3 days ago. A Gala invitation. Anonymous sender. A foundation that helped single mothers with medical expenses. She knew it was a trap, or a test, or both. "Your father forgot who he is," Naomi whispered, smoothing Marcus's hair. "But people can remember, baby. Sometimes they just need a reason." Marcus's breathing steadied into sleep. Naomi looked at the invitation, thought about walking into a room full of people who would measure her worth in thread count, thought about Charles, who chose image over love, who sent checks but never birthday cards. She made her decision. Not for pride, not for revenge. For Marcus. She would walk into that gala, endure the stares, ask for help, because some battles require you to fight on your knees. If you've ever swallowed your pride for someone you love, drop a comment. And if you're wondering whether Naomi should forgive Charles, stay with us. What happens when they face each other will shatter you before it rebuilds you. Subscribe if you believe redemption isn't given, it's earned through action. Because what Charles does next will define whether he's still the boy in the Civic or finally the man Naomi needed him to be. Tuesday, 2:47 p.m. PS 127 Playground. 7-year-old Marcus Carter climbed the monkey bars like he owned them. He'd been practicing for weeks, determined to cross the entire length without falling. His mother had told him practice makes perfect, and Marcus believed her because Naomi never lied about important things. Third rung from the end, his grip slipped. The fall was only 4 feet, but Marcus landed wrong. His right side hit the asphalt first, then his head bounced off the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of him, left him gasping on the blacktop while his classmates gathered in a circle of concern. Marcus, are you okay?" He tried to sit up. His vision blurred. His stomach hurt in a way that made him want to cry, but he didn't because boys weren't supposed to cry at school. "I'm fine," he whispered, but his voice sounded wrong even to him. The school nurse checked his pulse, his pupils, asked him to count backward from 10. He made it to 7 before the world tilted sideways and he collapsed into darkness. St. Catherine's emergency room, 3:23 p.m. Naomi arrived in scrubs, still wearing her ID badge from the morning shift. She'd been changing IV bags in the cardiac unit when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Carter, this is Principal Martinez from PS 127. Marcus had an accident. He's conscious now, but we're concerned about internal injuries. We've called an ambulance." Naomi's legs gave out. She slid down the wall outside room 412, her hands shaking so hard she dropped her phone twice trying to call her supervisor. The ambulance ride felt like eternity compressed into 17 minutes. Marcus lay on the gurney, small and pale, an IV already in his arm, his eyes fluttering open and closed. "Mama? I'm here, baby. I'm right here. Am I gonna die? No. No, baby, you're going to be fine." But Naomi was a nurse. She knew what the monitors were saying. Blood pressure dropping, heart rate elevated, the kind of numbers that made doctors move fast and speak in low voices. The CT scan revealed what she'd feared: internal bleeding, a ruptured spleen. Surgery required within 6 hours, or Marcus would die. The surgeon, Dr. Chen, pulled Naomi aside. "Mrs. Carter, we need to operate immediately. The procedure is $47,000. Do you have insurance?" Naomi nodded, but her stomach dropped. Her insurance would cover half, maybe less. She had $3,200 in savings. She'd been saving for Marcus's college fund, but now she'd drain it for his life. "Can I make payments?" Dr. Chen's face softened. "We'll work something out. But I need to know, is there anyone else? A father? Grandparents?" Naomi's throat closed. "There's no one else." But that wasn't entirely true. Charles Whitmore's office, 4:15 p.m. He was reviewing quarterly reports when his assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Whitmore, there's a call for you. A Dr. Chen from St. Catherine's Medical Center. He says it's urgent." Charles looked up from the spreadsheets. "I don't know any doctors, Chen. He says it's about your son." The words hit like a physical blow. Charles hadn't heard Marcus's name spoken aloud in 6 years. Not by him, not by anyone in his circle. He'd convinced himself the boy was Naomi's responsibility. that sending monthly checks absolved him of everything else. He picked up the phone. "Mr. Whitmore, this is Dr. Chen. I'm calling about Marcus Carter. He's been in an accident. We need to operate immediately, but there are some financial concerns I'd like to discuss." Charles's vision blurred, but not from the retinal degeneration. From something else entirely. Is he going to be okay?" "With surgery, yes. Without it, no. The procedure is expensive, and his mother is struggling with the costs. I thought you should know." Charles sat in silence for 30 seconds. He could hear Dr. Kia Chen breathing on the other end of the line. "How much?" $47,000. Insurance covers about half. I'll wire the money immediately, whatever he needs. "Mr. Whitmore, there's something else. Marcus asked about you. He wanted to know if his father was coming to see him." Charles felt something crack in his chest. I'll be there. Tell him I'm coming." He hung up and stared at his reflection in the window. The man looking back at him was 53 years old, worth $2.4 billion, and had never been more ashamed of himself. He'd spent 6 years pretending Marcus didn't exist. 6 years of birthday cards returned unopened. 6 years of Christmas presents sent but never acknowledged. 6 years of cowardice disguised as busyness. Now his son was bleeding internally, and Charles was the only one who could save him. But first, he had to tell Vanessa. Some people say Charles finally did the right thing. Others say it was too little too late. What do you think? Vanessa Holt's apartment, 5:30 p.m. She was preparing for the gala when Charles arrived, unannounced, his tie loose and his eyes wild with something she'd never seen before. "Charles, what's wrong?" "I need to tell you something. About my son." Vanessa's hands paused on her earrings. She'd known about Marcus, of course. She'd made it her business to know everything about Charles's past, every vulnerability she could exploit. "Your son. Charles, you don't have a son. You have a child support obligation. There's a difference." Charles felt the words like a slap. "He's 7 years old, Vanessa. He's bleeding internally. He needs surgery." Vanessa turned back to the mirror, adjusting her necklace. "And you're going to pay for it. That's what money is for, isn't it? To solve problems? It's not just about money. I need to be there. I need to see him. Charles, think about this rationally. You're about to announce the biggest philanthropic initiative of your career. The press will be there. Investors will be there. Do you really want to complicate that with personal drama?" She said personal drama like it was a disease. "Naomi is going to be there," Vanessa continued. "At the gala, I invited her." Charles's blood ran cold. "You what?" "I thought it would be good for the foundation's image. A single mother, struggling with medical bills, very sympathetic, very charitable. You're using her. I'm helping her. There's a difference." Vanessa smiled, the kind of smile that made Charles's skin crawl. "Besides, Charles, what are you going to do? Walk away from everything we've built together? From the life we've created? For what? A woman who's probably just after your money?" Charles stared at her, seeing her clearly for the first time in 18 months. "You don't know Naomi. I know enough. I know she's been trying to contact you for years. I know she's been sending letters, emails, even showing up at your office. I know she's desperate." Charles felt sick. "You've been intercepting her messages. I've been protecting you. From people who would use your guilt against you. From women who see dollar signs instead of faces." She walked over to him, touched his arm with practiced intimacy. "Charles, you're not the boy in the Civic anymore. You're a billionaire. Act like one." Would you have walked away from Vanessa right then, or stayed because the truth was too painful to face? Naomi's apartment, 7:45 p.m. She was packing Marcus's favorite pajamas for the hospital when the doorbell rang. A delivery man stood on her doorstep holding an envelope that looked expensive. Naomi Carter? Yes. Special delivery. You need to sign for this. The envelope was heavy, cream-colored, with gold lettering that caught the light from her hallway bulb. She signed the clipboard and closed the door, her hands shaking slightly. Inside the envelope, a gala invitation. The Whitmore Foundation Annual Charity Gala. Black tie. Friday night. The invitation mentioned a special initiative for single mothers facing medical crises, with funding available for families in need. Naomi sat on her couch, staring at the invitation like it was a snake. She knew it was a trap. She wasn't stupid, but she was desperate. Marcus's surgery was scheduled for Monday morning. She had 3 days to find $23,000, or she'd have to postpone the operation. And postponing meant risking his life. The invitation included a note, handwritten in elegant script. Dear Mrs. Carter, we understand you're facing difficult circumstances. The Whitmore Foundation is committed to helping families like yours. Please join us Friday evening. We'd be honored to have you as our guest. Sincerely, the Whitmore Foundation Board. Naomi read it 3 times. The handwriting looked familiar, but she couldn't place it. She thought about Charles, about the man who'd chosen image over love, who'd sent checks but never showed up, who'd let 6 years pass without a single visit. She thought about Marcus, lying in that hospital bed, asking if his father was coming. She thought about the $23,000 she didn't have. And she made her decision. If you were Naomi, would you have gone to that gala knowing it was probably a trap? Naomi sat in Marcus's hospital room, watching him sleep. The IV dripped steadily into his arm. The monitors beeped his heartbeat into the dark, and she held his small hand like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to the world. She'd been a nurse for 11 years. She'd seen families torn apart by medical bills. She'd watched parents choose between rent and medication, between dignity and survival. She'd never thought she'd be one of them. But here she was. The gala invitation sat on the bedside table next to Marcus's water cup and the get well cards from his classmates. She picked it up again, studied the gold lettering, the elegant script, the promise of help disguised as charity. Mama? Marcus's voice was small, drugged with pain medication, but his eyes were clear. Hey, baby, how are you feeling? Better. Is Dad coming? Naomi's heart broke a little more. I don't know, baby, but I'm going to try to get help for your surgery. From Dad? From people who can help us. Marcus nodded, but his eyes held a disappointment too old for 7. Mama, if Dad doesn't come, it's okay. You're enough. Naomi felt tears burn her eyes. She kissed Marcus's forehead, smoothed his hair, held his hand until he fell back asleep. Then she picked up the invitation and made her decision. Not for pride. Not for revenge. Not even for herself. For Marcus. She would walk into that gala. She would endure whatever came. She would ask for help from the man who'd abandoned them both. Because some battles require you to fight on your knees, and some children are worth swallowing your pride. If you've ever had to beg for help for someone you love, drop a comment. And if you're wondering whether Naomi should forgive Charles, stay with us. What happens when they face each other will break your heart before it heals it. Subscribe if you believe that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help, because what happens next will show you what real courage looks like. Friday, 8:47 p.m. The Metropolitan Ballroom. Naomi Carter stood in the marble foyer, wearing her mother's dress and carrying her son's medical bills in her purse. The room hummed with conversation, clinking crystal, and the kind of laughter that costs more per hour than most people earn in a week. She'd arrived alone, taken a cab she couldn't afford, and now stood near the staircase feeling like a character from a different story entirely. Vanessa spotted her first. "Charles, darling." Her voice carried like a blade wrapped in silk. "I didn't realize the event coordinators were doing outreach to community workers tonight. How progressive." The room pivoted. 300 pairs of eyes turned toward Naomi, measuring her worth in thread count and label recognition. Naomi felt the weight of every judgment, every assumption, every whispered comment about women who didn't belong in rooms like this. But she didn't bend. She looked directly at Vanessa and said quietly but clearly, "It belonged to my mother. She wore it to her nursing school graduation. She taught me that dignity doesn't come with a price tag." The room inhaled. Somewhere a glass clinked against marble. Vanessa's smile sharpened. "How quaint. And tell me, what brings a nurse, is it, to an event where tickets cost more than most people's monthly rent?" Naomi's hands trembled against her purse, but her voice stayed steady. "I came because my son needs surgery, because I was told this foundation helps families in crisis, because sometimes desperate mothers do desperate things." The silence stretched. Naomi could feel Charles watching from table 1, could sense his internal struggle between cowardice and conscience. Vanessa moved closer, her heels clicking against marble like a countdown. "That's touching, really. But tell me, Naomi, if you're so desperate, why didn't you just ask Charles directly? Why the public spectacle?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Naomi felt every eye on her, waiting for her to break, to cry, to confirm their assumptions about women who didn't belong. But Naomi had spent 6 years building walls around her heart. She wasn't about to let Vanessa tear them down. If you've ever been publicly humiliated, drop a comment, because what Naomi does next will show you what real strength looks like. Charles Whitmore sat at table 1, watching Naomi stand her ground against Vanessa's cruelty, and felt something crack open in his chest. He'd spent 6 years pretending she didn't exist. 6 years of birthday cards returned unopened. 6 years of Christmas presents sent but never acknowledged. 6 years of cowardice disguised as busyness. Now she stood in a room full of people who measured worth in connections and cash, and she was the only one who looked like she belonged there. Vanessa's voice cut through the tension. "If you're so desperate, why didn't you just ask Charles directly? Why the public spectacle?" Charles felt the question like a physical blow, because he knew the answer. Because he'd been avoiding Naomi's calls, her letters, her desperate attempts to reach him for 6 years. Because he was a coward. But watching Naomi stand there, dignified and desperate and stronger than anyone in that room, something shifted in him. He stood. The entire ballroom pivoted, as if pulled by invisible strings. His voice carried the weight of a man who had spent decades commanding rooms. "That is my son's mother." Silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of collective shock. 300 people holding their breath, waiting to see what happens when a billionaire chooses truth over image. "The woman you are mocking," Charles continued, his hands steady on the table edge, "raised our son while I hid behind excuses and cowardice. She worked double shifts so he could eat. She sang him to sleep when I was too proud to even send a card. Her dress might be old, Vanessa, but it has more honor in its seams than anything you've ever worn." Naomi's face remained calm, but her hands trembled slightly against her purse. She had not expected this. She had not expected him to remember what honor felt like. Vanessa's smile faltered, then reformed, sharper now, dangerous. "Charles, you're emotional. Perhaps we should step outside and—" "No," his voice was firm. "I'm done stepping outside. I'm done hiding." He turned to Naomi, and even through the blur of failing sight, he saw her clearly for the first time in 6 years. "I'm sorry," he said. "For all of it." Some people say Charles finally did the right thing. Others say it was too little, too late. What do you think? The room held its breath. Naomi looked at Charles, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't seen in 6 years. The man she'd fallen in love with. Not the billionaire who'd abandoned them, but the man who'd once told her the truth on a first meeting. She felt the weight of every eye in the room, every judgment, every assumption about women who didn't belong in places like this. But she also felt something else. The weight of her son's medical bills, the desperation of a mother who would do anything to save her child, the exhaustion of 6 years of fighting alone. "Thank you," she said quietly. "But sorry doesn't pay for surgery." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Charles felt them like a physical blow. "You're right," he said. "It doesn't." He walked toward her through the crowd that parted like water until he stood directly in front of her. "Naomi, I want to help. Not just with the surgery, with everything. I want to be Marcus's father. I want to be the man you thought I was." Naomi looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the boy in the Civic. The man who'd once been afraid of being poor. The billionaire who'd forgotten what it felt like to be human. "I don't know if you can be that man," she said quietly. "But I know Marcus deserves to find out." The room exhaled. The tension shifted. Something had changed, something fundamental, something that couldn't be undone. Would you have forgiven Charles in that moment, or walked away? Tell me in the comments. The gala ended in whispers. Guests filed out of the ballroom, their conversations hushed but urgent, their eyes darting between Charles, Naomi, and Vanessa like spectators at a tennis match. Vanessa left first, her face a mask of controlled fury, her heels clicking against marble like gunshots. Charles stayed behind talking to Naomi in low voices, their conversation private but their body language speaking volumes. The press arrived within hours. Photographers camped outside the ballroom, waiting for the story that would sell papers and drive clicks. By morning, the headlines were everywhere. Billionaire CEO reunites with son's mother at charity gala. Whitmore Foundation scandal, Mistress versus mother. Charles, Whitmore's secret son. The story behind the drama. The story spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with opinions, judgments, and armchair analysis of a situation most people didn't understand. Vanessa's publicist released a statement. "Ms. Holt is focused on her work with the Whitmore Foundation. She has no comment on Mr. Whitmore's personal life." Charles's team released their own statement. "Mr. Whitmore is committed to being a present father to his son and supporting Marcus's mother during this difficult time." But the real story was happening behind closed doors. If you're not subscribed, I need to ask you something. Why not? Because what happens next will show you what real justice looks like. Charles's penthouse. 11:23 p.m. Naomi sat on his couch, holding a cup of tea she hadn't touched, watching him pace the length of his living room like a caged animal. "I should have been there," Charles said, his voice raw with self-loathing. "I should have been there for Marcus, for you. I should have been the man you thought I was." Naomi looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the boy in the Civic, The man who'd once been afraid of being poor, the billionaire who'd forgotten what it felt like to be human. "You can't undo the past," she said quietly, "but you can decide who you are today." Charles stopped pacing. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something he hadn't seen in 6 years. The woman who'd loved him when he had nothing. The woman who'd believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. "I'm losing my sight," he said suddenly. "Retinal degeneration. In 2 years, I'll be legally blind." Naomi's hands stilled on her cup. "Charles, I can't see clearly anymore. Not just physically. I've been blind to what matters for years. I've been blind to you, to Marcus, to everything that actually counts." He sat down across from her, his hands shaking slightly. "Naomi, I want to help. Not just with the surgery, with everything. I want to be Marcus's father. I want to be the man you thought I was." Naomi looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the boy in the Civic, the man who'd once been afraid of being poor, the billionaire who'd forgotten what it felt like to be human. "I don't know if you can be that man," she said quietly, "but I know Marcus deserves to find out." The words hung in the air like a promise. Charles felt them like a physical weight, the kind of weight that could either crush him or make him stronger. "I'll prove it," he said. "I'll prove I can be the man you thought I was." Some people say Charles finally did the right thing. Others say it was too little, too late. What do you think? Naomi left Charles's penthouse at 1:17 a.m., carrying with her the weight of 6 years of hurt and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, people could change. She'd agreed to let Charles visit Marcus in the hospital. She'd agreed to let him pay for the surgery. She'd agreed to give him a chance to prove he could be the father Marcus deserved. But she hadn't agreed to forgive him. Not yet. Charles sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the city lights through windows that cost more than most people's homes, and felt something he hadn't felt in years, the weight of responsibility, the burden of being needed, the terrifying freedom of having someone to lose. He picked up his phone and called his assistant. "Cancel all my meetings tomorrow. I'm going to the hospital." "Mr. Whitmore, you have the board meeting at 10 a.m., the quarterly review at 2 p.m., the investor call at 4 p.m. Cancel them all. I'm going to see my son." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for 10 seconds. "Mr. Whitmore, are you sure? The board meeting is about the foundation restructuring. Ms. Holt has been preparing for weeks." Charles felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What foundation restructuring? Ms. Holt didn't tell you?" "She's been working on a proposal to redirect foundation funds to more strategic initiatives. She said you approved it." Charles felt the floor tilt beneath him. "I never approved anything. What kind of strategic initiatives?" "Ms. Holt said the current programs were too focused on community outreach. She wanted to redirect funds to more high-profile causes, better for the company's image." Charles felt sick. "Get me everything, every document, every email, every proposal. I want to see what she's been doing." He hung up and stared at his reflection in the window. The man looking back at him was 53 years old, worth $2.4 billion, and had never been more ashamed of himself. He'd spent 6 years pretending Marcus didn't exist. 6 years of birthday cards returned unopened. 6 years of Christmas presents sent but never acknowledged. 6 years of cowardice disguised as busyness. Now his son was bleeding internally, and Charles was the only one who could save him. But first, he had to find out what Vanessa had been doing behind his back. If you've ever had to choose between your pride and your child's life, drop a comment. because Charles is about to make a choice that will change everything. Subscribe if you believe that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help, because what happens next will show you what real courage looks like. Monday, 9:23 a.m. Whitmore Industries headquarters. Sarah Chen sat at her desk in the accounting department, staring at numbers that didn't add up. She was 26 years old, fresh out of business school, and had been working at Whitmore Industries for exactly 3 months. Her job was simple: reconcile foundation accounts, process charitable donations, ensure compliance with nonprofit regulations. It was supposed to be straightforward, routine, the kind of work that paid the bills while she figured out what she actually wanted to do with her life. But these numbers were wrong. The Whitmore Foundation's quarterly report showed $2.3 million in charitable disbursements, but when Sarah cross-referenced the individual transactions, she found discrepancies that made her stomach drop. $180,000 marked as educational grants had been transferred to a shell company called Horizon Ventures LLC. $95,000 labeled medical assistance had been redirected to a consulting firm called Strategic Solutions Group. $67,000 designated for community outreach had been funneled through 3 different accounts before disappearing entirely. Sarah pulled up the foundation's bylaws, the IRS filings, the board meeting minutes. She read through every document, every email, every signature, and she found something that made her blood run cold. The foundation's board had never approved these transfers. The signatures on the documents were forged. The shell companies were registered to addresses that didn't exist. Someone had been stealing from a charity. Sarah picked up her phone, then put it down. She picked it up again, then put it down again. She was a junior accountant. She was 3 months into her first real job. She was supposed to keep her head down, do her work, not rock the boat, but she was also the daughter of immigrants who'd taught her that integrity wasn't negotiable. She called her supervisor. "Mr. Rodriguez, I need to show you something. It's about the foundation accounts. If you've ever had to choose between keeping your job and doing what's right, drop a comment. Because Sarah is about to make a choice that will change everything." St. Catherine's Medical Center, 2:47 p.m. Naomi sat beside Marcus's bed, watching him sleep peacefully for the first time in days. The surgery had been successful. The internal bleeding had stopped. Her son was going to live. But the cost had been more than financial. Charles had paid for everything: the surgery, the hospital stay, the follow-up care. He'd been there every day, sitting in the uncomfortable chair beside Marcus's bed, reading to him, playing games with him, being the father he'd never been. Marcus had been confused at first. "Mama, is this really my dad?" "Yes, baby. This is your dad." "Is he going to stay this time?" Naomi had looked at Charles, really looked at him, and seen something she hadn't seen in 6 years. The man she'd fallen in love with. "I don't know, baby, but I hope so." Now, sitting in the quiet hospital room, Naomi felt the weight of everything that had happened. The gala, the public humiliation, the private reconciliation, the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, people could change. Her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Carter, this is Sarah Chen from Whitmore Industries. I'm calling about the foundation investigation. I need to ask you some questions." Naomi's heart skipped a beat. What kind of questions? Questions about Ms. Holt, about the foundation, about what really happened at the gala. Naomi looked at Marcus, sleeping peacefully, and felt the weight of every choice she'd made. "I'll answer your questions," she said quietly. "But I need to know something first. Are you trying to help, or are you trying to hurt Charles?" Sarah's voice was steady. "I'm trying to find the truth, and I think you can help me." Naomi made her decision. Not for Charles. Not for revenge. Not even for herself. For Marcus. She would tell the truth, even if it destroyed everything. Some people say Naomi should have stayed silent to protect herself. Others say she did the right thing by speaking up. What do you think? Whitmore Industries boardroom, 4:15 p.m. Charles. Whitmore sat at the head of the table, surrounded by men and women who'd built their careers on making difficult decisions. The quarterly board meeting was supposed to be routine. Financial reports, strategic planning, foundation updates. But nothing about this meeting was routine. Sarah Chen stood at the front of the room, her hands shaking slightly as she presented her findings. She'd spent the weekend compiling evidence, cross-referencing documents, building a case that would either make her career or end it. "Ms. Chen," said Robert Martinez, the board chairman, "you're telling us that someone has been embezzling from our foundation." "Yes, sir. Over the past 18 months, approximately $1.2 million has been misappropriated through shell companies and forged documents." The room went silent. Charles felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Who?" he asked quietly. Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man who'd spent 6 years pretending his son didn't exist. The billionaire who'd forgotten what it felt like to be human. "Miss Holt, sir. Vanessa Holt?" The words hit like a physical blow. Charles felt the floor tilt beneath him. "Show me," he said. Sarah pulled up the documents on the screen, the forged signatures, the shell companies, the redirected funds, the evidence that Vanessa had been stealing from a charity while pretending to run it. Charles stared at the screen, seeing his own blindness reflected back at him. He'd trusted Vanessa. He'd given her access to everything. He'd let her manipulate him, control him, use his failing eyesight as an excuse to make decisions he never would have made. And she'd been stealing from him the entire time. "Mr. Whitmore," said Sarah, "there's something else. Ms. Holt has been intercepting communications. Letters, emails, phone calls. She's been controlling what information reaches you." Charles felt sick. "What kind of communications?" "From Ms. Carter, sir. From your son's mother. She's been trying to contact you for years. Miss Holt has been blocking those communications." The room held its breath. Charles felt the weight of every eye on him, every judgment, every assumption about the kind of man who would let someone else control his life. "I need to see everything," he said quietly. "Every document, every email, every piece of evidence. I need to see what she's been doing." "Would you have fired Vanessa immediately, or given her a chance to explain? Tell me in the comments." Sarah Chen pulled up another document on the screen. "This is a recording from Ms. Holt's office," she said quietly. "It was made 3 weeks ago, during a conversation with Ms. Carter." The room went silent. Charles felt his heart skip a beat. "Play it," he said. Sarah clicked the play button. Vanessa's voice filled the boardroom, cold and calculated. The voice of a woman who'd been planning this for months. "Ms. Carter, I understand you're facing difficult circumstances. The foundation is committed to helping families like yours. But I need to be clear about something. Charles doesn't know about your situation. He doesn't know about your son, and he's not going to find out." Naomi's voice steady but desperate. "Ms. Holt, I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for help. My son needs surgery. I need to speak with Charles directly." Vanessa's voice, sharp and dangerous. "Charles is a busy man, Ms. Carter. He doesn't have time for personal drama. He doesn't have time for women who see dollar signs instead of faces. He doesn't have time for children who don't fit his image." The recording continued. Vanessa's voice cold and calculated. I'm going to make this simple for you, Ms. Carter. You can take the money and disappear, or you can try to contact Charles directly and watch me destroy everything you've built. Your choice." The recording ended. The room held its breath. Charles felt the weight of every eye on him, every judgment, every assumption about the kind of man who would let someone else control his life. "I need to see everything," he said quietly. "Every document, every email, every piece of evidence. I need to see what she's been doing." Sarah pulled up another document. "This is the Foundation's financial statement from last quarter. Ms. Holt has been redirecting funds meant for children's medical expenses to her own consulting firm. She's been using your foundation to fund her own business." Charles stared at the screen, seeing his own blindness reflected back at him. He'd trusted Vanessa. He'd given her access to everything. He'd let her manipulate him, control him, use his failing eyesight as an excuse to make decisions he never would have made. And she'd been stealing from him the entire time. Some people say Charles should have seen this coming. Others say Vanessa was too clever. What do you think? Charles Whitmore stood in the boardroom, surrounded by evidence of his own blindness, and felt something crack open in his chest. He'd spent 6 years pretending Marcus didn't exist. 6 years of birthday cards returned unopened. 6 years of Christmas presents sent but never acknowledged. 6 years of cowardice disguised as busyness. Now, he stood in a room full of people who'd built their careers on making difficult decisions, and he had to make the most difficult decision of his life. "Mr. Whitmore," said Robert Martinez, "what would you like us to do?" Charles looked at the evidence on the screen. The forged signatures, the shell companies, the redirected funds, the recordings that exposed Vanessa's true nature. He thought about Naomi, standing in that ballroom, dignified and desperate and stronger than anyone in the room. He thought about Marcus, lying in that hospital bed asking if his father was coming. He thought about the boy in the Civic, the man who'd once been afraid of being poor, the billionaire who'd forgotten what it felt like to be human. "I want her fired," he said quietly. "I want her prosecuted. I want her to pay for what she's done." The room held its breath. Charles felt the weight of every eye on him, every judgment, every assumption about the kind of man who would let someone else control his life. "But first," he continued, "I want to see my son. I want to be the father he deserves. I want to be the man Naomi thought I was." The words hung in the air like a promise. Charles felt them like a physical weight, the kind of weight that could either crush him or make him stronger. "I'll prove it," he said. "I'll prove I can be the man you thought I was." Would you have fired Vanessa immediately, or given her a chance to explain? The boardroom fell silent. Robert Martinez looked at Charles, really looked at him, and saw something he hadn't seen in years. The man who'd built an empire from nothing, the billionaire who'd forgotten what it felt like to be human. "Mr. Whitmore," he said quietly, "we need to discuss the Foundation's future. Ms. Holt's actions have compromised our credibility. We need to restructure, rebuild, regain the trust of our donors." Charles nodded. "I agree. But first I want to make sure Marcus gets the care he needs. I want to make sure Naomi has the support she deserves. I want to make sure this foundation actually helps the people it's supposed to help." The board members exchanged glances. They'd built their careers on making difficult decisions, but this was different. This was personal. This was about a man who'd finally chosen conscience over convenience. "Mr. Whitmore," said Sarah Chen, "I'd like to propose something. The Foundation needs new leadership, someone who understands what it's like to struggle, someone who knows what it's like to need help. Charles looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the daughter of immigrants who'd taught her that integrity wasn't negotiable. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we appoint Ms. Carter as the Foundation's new director. She's a nurse, she's a mother. She's someone who understands what it's like to need help. She's someone who can rebuild this foundation's credibility." The room held its breath. Charles felt the weight of every eye on him, every judgment, every assumption about the kind of man who would let someone else control his life. "I think that's a brilliant idea," he said quietly. "But first, I need to ask Naomi if she's willing to take on that responsibility." The board members nodded. They'd built their careers on making difficult decisions, but this was different. This was about a man who'd finally chosen conscience over convenience. "If you're not subscribed, I need to ask you something." "Why not?" "Because what happens next will show you what real justice looks like. Subscribe if you believe that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help. Because what happens next will show you what real courage looks like." Tuesday, 10:47 a.m. Vanessa Holt's apartment. The eviction notice arrived by certified mail, delivered by a process server who'd been trying to serve her for 3 days. She'd been hiding, changing hotels, using cash for everything, but the law had finally caught up with her. The notice was simple. "You are hereby ordered to vacate the premises within 72 hours. Failure to comply will result in immediate removal by law enforcement." Vanessa stared at the document, her hands shaking slightly. She'd been living in Charles's penthouse for 18 months, rent-free, with access to everything. His credit cards, his foundation, his life. Now she had nothing. Her phone buzzed, a text from her lawyer. "Vanessa, we need to talk. The DA's office is considering charges, embezzlement, fraud, forgery. This is serious." Vanessa deleted the text. She'd been deleting texts for weeks, ever since the board meeting, ever since Charles had fired her and called the police. She'd thought she was untouchable. She'd thought her charm, her connections, her ability to manipulate men would protect her from consequences. She'd been wrong. The doorbell rang. Vanessa peered through the peephole and saw 2 men in suits, badges clipped to their belts. "Ms. Holt, this is Detective Rodriguez and Detective Chen. We need to ask you some questions about the Whitmore Foundation investigation." Vanessa felt her blood run cold. She'd been expecting this, dreading this, but now that it was here, she felt like she was drowning. She opened the door. "Ms. Holt, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and forgery. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Vanessa felt the handcuffs click around her wrists, felt the weight of everything she'd built come crashing down around her. She'd thought she was untouchable. She'd thought her charm, her connections, her ability to manipulate men would protect her from consequences. She'd been wrong. St. Catherine's Medical Center, 2:23 p.m. Charles Whitmore sat beside Marcus's bed, reading from a book about a boy who discovered he could fly. Marcus was 7 years old, recovering from surgery, and for the first time in his life, he had a father who showed up. "Mama says you're really my dad," Marcus said, looking up at Charles with eyes that held too much hurt for 7. "I am," Charles said quietly, "and I'm sorry. It took me so long to be here." "Why didn't you come before?" Charles felt the question like a physical blow. He'd spent 6 years pretending Marcus didn't exist, 6 years of birthday cards returned unopened, 6 years of Christmas presents sent but never acknowledged. "Because I was scared," he said finally. "Because I thought I wasn't good enough to be your father. Because I thought you were better off without me." Marcus nodded, but his eyes held disappointment too old for 7. "But you're here now," he said quietly. "I am," Charles said, "and I'm not going anywhere." Naomi stood in the doorway, watching them together, and felt something crack open in her chest. She'd spent 6 years building walls around her heart, 6 years of fighting alone, 6 years of pretending she didn't need anyone. Now she watched Charles read to their son, watched him be the father Marcus deserved, and felt the weight of every choice she'd made. "Mama," Marcus said, looking up at her. "Is Dad going to stay this time?" Naomi looked at Charles, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't seen in 6 years, the man she'd fallen in love with. "I don't know, baby," she said quietly, "but I hope so." Charles looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the woman who'd loved him when he had nothing, the woman who'd believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. "I'll prove it," he said quietly. "I'll prove I can be the man you thought I was." The words hung in the air like a promise. Naomi felt them like a physical weight, the kind of weight that could either crush her or make her stronger. "I hope so," she said quietly, "because Marcus deserves to have a father who shows up." Some people say Charles finally did the right thing. Others say it was too little, too late. What do you think? Friday, 3:47 p.m. PS 127 Playground. Naomi stood at the edge of the playground, watching Marcus climb the monkey bars with the same determination he'd shown before the accident. But this time, he wasn't alone. Charles stood beneath the bars, his hands ready to catch Marcus if he fell, his eyes watching their son with the kind of love that comes from finally understanding what you almost lost. "Mama, watch," Marcus called, swinging from bar to bar with the confidence of a child who knew he was safe. "I'm watching, baby," Naomi called back, her heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. Charles looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the woman who'd loved him when he had nothing, the woman who'd believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving me a second chance." Naomi looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the boy in the Civic, the man who'd once been afraid of being poor, the billionaire who'd forgotten what it felt like to be human. "I didn't give you a second chance," she said quietly. "Marcus did. He's the one who decided you were worth forgiving." Charles felt the words like a physical weight. He'd spent 6 years pretending Marcus didn't exist. 6 years of birthday cards returned unopened. 6 years of Christmas presents sent but never acknowledged. Now he stood beneath the monkey bars, watching their son climb with the confidence of a child who knew he was safe and felt the weight of every choice he'd made. "I'll prove it," he said quietly. "I'll prove I can be the man you thought I was." The words hung in the air like a promise. Naomi felt them like a physical weight, the kind of weight that could either crush her or make her stronger. "I hope so," she said quietly, "because Marcus deserves to have a father who shows up." If you've ever had to forgive someone who hurt you, drop a comment, because what Naomi did for Charles will show you what real strength looks like. 3 months later. The Whitmore Foundation offices. Naomi sat at her new desk surrounded by files and reports and the weight of responsibility she'd never asked for but had accepted anyway. She'd been the foundation's director for 3 months, and in that time, she'd rebuilt everything Vanessa had destroyed. The foundation now focused on what it was supposed to focus on: helping families in crisis, providing medical assistance, supporting single mothers who were fighting battles they never asked for. Naomi had seen the numbers. The foundation had helped over 200 families in 3 months. Medical bills paid, rent covered, children fed. Real help for real people who needed it. Her phone buzzed. A text from Charles. "Marcus wants to know if you're coming to dinner tonight. He's making mac and cheese." Naomi smiled. Charles had been cooking dinner for them every Friday night for 3 months. He'd been learning to be a father, learning to be a man, learning to be the person Naomi had always known he could be. She texted back, "Tell him I'll be there, and tell him I'm bringing dessert." Charles texted back, "He says you're the best mom ever. I agree." Naomi felt something warm spread through her chest. She'd spent 6 years building walls around her heart. 6 years of fighting alone, 6 years of pretending she didn't need anyone. Now she had a family, a real family, a family that showed up, that stayed, that chose love over fear. She looked at the photo on her desk. Marcus, Charles, and herself, taken at the playground 3 months ago. Marcus was smiling. Charles was laughing. And Naomi was looking at them both with the kind of love that comes from finally understanding what you almost lost. Some people say Naomi should have walked away from Charles. Others say she did the right thing by giving him a second chance. What do you think? 6 months later. The Whitmore Foundation Annual Gala. Naomi stood at the podium, surrounded by donors and board members and the kind of people who measured worth in connections and cash. But this time, she belonged there. This time, she was the one telling the story. 6 months ago, I stood in this room as a single mother desperate for help. She said, her voice steady and strong. Today, I stand here as the director of a foundation that has helped over 500 families in crisis. The room held its breath. Naomi felt the weight of every eye on her, every judgment, every assumption about women who didn't belong in places like this. "But this isn't about me," she continued. "This is about the families we've helped, the children we've fed, the medical bills we've paid, the hope we've restored." She looked at Charles, sitting in the front row, holding Marcus's hand, and saw the man who'd finally chosen conscience over convenience. "This is about what happens when we choose to see each other as human beings instead of problems to be solved," she said quietly. "This is about what happens when we choose love over fear." The room erupted in applause. Naomi felt the weight of every eye on her, every judgment, every assumption about women who didn't belong in places like this. But this time, she belonged there. This time, she was the one telling the story. If you've ever had to choose between love and fear, drop a comment, because what Naomi chose will show you what real courage looks like. Naomi looked out at the room, at the donors and board members and the kind of people who measured worth in connections and cash, and felt the weight of every choice she'd made. 6 months ago, I stood in this room as a single mother desperate for help, she said, her voice steady and strong. Today, I stand here as the director of a foundation that has helped over 500 families in crisis. The room held its breath. Naomi felt the weight of every eye on her, every judgment, every assumption about women who didn't belong in places like this. "But this isn't about me," she continued. "This is about the families we've helped, the children we've fed, the medical bills we've paid, the hope we've restored." She looked at Charles sitting in the front row, holding Marcus's hand, and saw the man who'd finally chosen conscience over convenience. "This is about what happens when we choose to see each other as human beings instead of problems to be solved," she said quietly. "This is about what happens when we choose love over fear." The room erupted in applause. Naomi felt the weight of every eye on her, every judgment, every assumption about women who didn't belong in places like this. But this time, she belonged there. This time, she was the one telling the story. Would you have forgiven Charles after everything he did? Would you have given him a second chance? Tell me in the comments below. And if you're not subscribed, I need to ask you something. Why not? Because stories like this don't happen by accident. They happen when people choose to see each other as human beings instead of problems to be solved. Subscribe if you believe that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help. Because what happens next will show you what real courage looks like. We'll be back tomorrow with another story about what happens when people choose love over fear. Until then, remember, sometimes the person you underestimate is the one holding all the cards, and sometimes the person you think is your enemy is actually your greatest teacher. Thank you for watching. Thank you for believing in second chances, and thank you for choosing to see the humanity in everyone, even when it's hard. Because that's what changes everything.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.